start here. The Columbia essay, The Learning to Live, was actually published in a book that was not one of Merton's books, and then published posthumously in one of his things, in this book, Love and Living. And then the other one, I don't know if any of you got a chance to read The Wisdom of the Desert. It's one of my favorite essays, but it's kind of esoteric, right? And it comes as the beginning essay in this book called The Wisdom of the Desert, which is it's really mostly just a collection of sayings of the early desert, mostly fathers. I don't really think there's many sayings from desert mothers. But he liked those things. He liked to do like little kind of translations, summations of little kind of pithy quotes like that. If any of you are familiar with the Jesuit Tony DeMello, 1 minute wisdom, 1 minute nonsense, Sedana, those kind of things, where he'll just take these little, the master says kind of stories and just give you little pithy things like that. He thought that they felt a lot like Zen koans or Zen mondos, and so he liked to just put those little things out there. Learning information is the least important thing that you would do with those kinds of things. They're meant to be, like I said last time, a wake-up as opposed to information that you would glean. So what he was actually translating there and compiling was a kind of a scattered work called the Apophthegmata, which is a series of sayings by the early desert fathers and mothers. He was mostly focusing on a number of people like Anthony of the Desert, whom some of you may have read, like Athanasius' kind of classic biography of Anthony. And they're just these little pithy quotes about what it means to be a real person. And then, so the one on existentialism was from this book, Mystics and Zen Masters, which is kind of a collection of his attempts to look at the ways that wisdom traditions flourish around the world. So he's got essays on existentialism, he's got stuff on Western monasticism, Eastern monasticism, Jewish, the Jewish wisdom traditions. He's got stuff on Zen, obviously, hence the name. A number of other traditions that he saw with the same kind of spiritual, contemplative tradition that he was rediscovering after 20 years in the monastery, right? So I thought all these things came together because the existentialism article in there talks about that the question that the existentialists are asking is not the question that classical metaphysics is asking, which is, what is this? What is this essence that we have in front of us here? But that existentialism is asking, who is the person that's asking this? And if you got a chance to read the Learning to Live essay, he talks there. What's really important in university education is not the stuff that you learn, not the information that is poured into you as an empty receptacle, but the learning who it is that's asking the questions, who it is that is being educated in the first place, and it's not just a matter of piling more stuff into a vessel to, that you come out an educated person in the sense of knowing things, but in the sense of coming more into contact with that spark, that kind of communication of opposites, as he's pointing to, that meeting of life and death and God and humanity and all those things in that kind of event that he says is at the heart of the human person. So he really, I did a little Google search on this last week. I just put in Merton and infallibility, not because Merton was an infallible thinker, quite far from it, but it becomes a kind of dirty word for Merton, ironically, as a Catholic monk, to talk about infallibility, because that means sort of getting out from under what he saw as the baseline of the human condition. We are fallible. We don't know things. We are subject to limitations. And the attempt to speak perfectly, to speak for all time, to speak without, concern about being wrong or being subject to correction, for him that was a kind of dodge from humanity. And if anything, he is learning in these later years that we're focusing on to figure out how to retrieve humanity, right? If you remember if you remember what I was saying in the first class, for those of you who were here, that his Christology, his understanding of Jesus is not as the kind of three-stage Christology that Christians tend to talk about from John's Gospel, this pre-existing divine being who drops in and kind of pretends to be human for a little while and then disappears. And that's not classical. That's not real classical Christian theology. That's the way a lot of Christians have thought. Jesus is kind of God walking around in a Halloween costume, like pretending to be human. And what Merton is trying to say is that the fullness of divinity is a retrieval of the humanity that we mostly run away from, right? And that this existentialism that he's understanding is bursting in the West, especially in Europe, but also in America to a lesser degree. The stuff that he's seeing in Zen, which is very much trying to cut through the filters, that he's seeing retrieval of like the apophthegma to those desert fathers and mothers, with their kind of pithy and no-nonsense statements, are an attempt to get back to the simplicity of humanity that doesn't need to puff itself up, right? And he's understanding that kind of cosmic humility, if you can call it that, as something that Western society has really not done a great job of hanging on to, in terms of how easily we invest our worth in what we can produce. Or, as I've said before, my foibles. How many degrees do I have hanging on my wall? How many books do I have on my shelf? How long is my CV? How often do I go to church? Any of those things that good in themselves can become a way of inflating what otherwise feels, as he says in Learning to Live, kind of naked, right? And I don't know about you, but Dr. Schimmel put that quote from Learning to Live about uneducated graduates. The problem of education. I'm actually going to read it to you because I just love it. I don't know if it stuck out for you, but Maret Khalil asked me if I had a quote for her today, and I gave her that, and then it showed up on Dr. Schimmel's Facebook page. I just thought that was sort of serendipitous or fortuitous or something. That we who are, most of us who are in an educational institution, do we have a sense of what we're doing here, And for the last umpteen years, I've had my Theo 100 students read this essay, because for most of them, it's their first semester in college. They spent a lot of time being taught information and mostly being taught how to regurgitate information, and that's not what I do in the classes that I teach, for credit, let alone a saying like this. But this, to me, it gives a sense of what his understanding of education is about, or at least the way that education has missed the mark. The danger of education, I have found, is that it so easily confuses means with ends. Worse than that, it quite easily forgets both and devotes itself merely to the mass production of uneducated graduates. People literally unfit for anything except to take part in an elaborate and completely artificial charade which they and their contemporaries have conspired to call life. When you stop for a second, you say, well, what else is a university supposed to be doing except preparing you for life, right? And then he launches into that thing about success. And that just puts a knife in my heart every time I read it, because again, success as has been usually measured, it's insidious. It gets in my guts. It's like Rain and the Rhinoceros, right? Where is the city? It's not out there. I can't just say, oh, you people have got it all screwed up. It's right in here. That insidious misunderstanding of what real life is about is living right in here. What I thought I might do today is just take a couple of minutes, 5 minutes or so, and just give y'all a chance to group together in little groupings, however many, and talk amongst yourselves in your life, not an abstract thing. In your life, what does success mean to you? What does it mean to you to be successful? And do you have to sort of stop and think about it and remind yourself, oh, no, this isn't what it usually is? Do you have to sort of catch yourself, or is your version of success like your first go-to? You know what I mean there? Do you have to unhook yourself from some version to remind yourself that maybe that isn't the real stuff? So maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and we can talk a little bit amongst ourselves, and then maybe come back and process a little bit together, see what we got. Okay. So I heard a lot of good things going on. Anybody have anything that you would like to put forward that we might just commiserate together about success? Yeah.
Something that I talked about was like for me, like becoming a theology major was like the moment where like I let go of like success in the way that like not like in the way that like society defines it, I guess, because that was like the moment when I realized that like I'm probably never gonna have a ton of money, like I'm probably not ever gonna be like driving a really nice BMW and I don't know, whatever that version of success looks like. But instead, like, I had to, like, start defining success by myself as opposed to, like, letting other people define it for me, which I think is much more of, like, a process and more of, like, an everyday thing. That was something else.
so you realize that the usual definition is out of your grasp as soon as you start majoring in theology.
Yeah, basically.
A lot of theology majors in here.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's way more about the process. Because we were talking in our group about how you can define success as, or how I have defined it as, is having very much a white suburban lifestyle. It's sort of what I was raised to believe was the ultimate. So you can work yourself to go to, take AP classes in high school so you can get college credit, so you can graduate faster with honors, so you can get a car, so you can get a job, and it's just like this path that's just, I don't know, like so laid out for me, and defining success in college was like stepping out of that path and saying, what do I want? And for me, success is just like the pursuit of truth, in whatever way that looks. And a lot of times that looks like asking questions that lead to more questions instead of answers, but not having an end goal per se, but just being in the present and continuing the process of asking those questions and defining what success is for me, as an individual who is just trying to find out what is true.
Great, thanks.
I mean, I was telling them, like, I'm kind of like in the middle, like I have really no clue at the moment, because I definitely feel like as being like rejected from pretty much every program I've applied to for graduate work after this. It's like, so now I'm like, okay, well now I have to totally reconfigure whatever it is I thought might be successful. And it's kind of liberating, you know, I've kind of had to throw away a lot of stuff and kind of rework it. So in a sense, it's terrifying, but in a very liberating sort of way. So, I mean, I don't know, like, now I can no longer sort of think, oh, like, what grades I make now. I kind of don't really give a shit, like, what grades I make now. Because, like, I'm done. Like, I'm just sort of, like, now I'm kind of, like, thinking about it, like, that doesn't hold any meaning for me anymore. So, I'm trying to figure out what it is that makes meaning for me. I don't really know yet. Yeah.
It's kind of like, you don't have the option of getting to define success the way that it's usually been defined. Maybe that, I mean, I bet that stings right now. We sort of moored our way into learning a new way of thinking about success.
We talked about struggling a little with Merton's idea of success and wondering if he has room for any form of success, or if he just kind of views humanity as like accepting that part of humanity is failure. But I brought up T's comment a few classes ago, and she said it's really easy for Merton to say, you know, success isn't a worthwhile pursuit when he's already a success. When he has someone calling him and asking him, how do you be a success? Then it's easy to say, I'm not a success. I don't want to be a success. Right. So
he has the luxury of doing that.
Yeah.
And I know for me that's insidious. I don't know if anybody else, but I think I spent 15 years in a religious life, so all of the usual markers of car and everything, all the usual markers of car and money and all that stuff went away when I was very young, but there was other modes of success that took its place and that are, I think, at least as insidious because they masquerade as good things, right? Like being Merton's kind of success. I want millions of people to read me because of course I've got things to say that are going to help lots of people, so why wouldn't I want to do that, you know? And that's, in its own way, it's less about the other people, and it's way more about me being the one that's doing the helping.
And I talked about, my notion of success, or the one that my false notion of success is being right. But I think we all want to do the right thing, and so for all of us, a lot of it was the breakdown of like the means to getting to the end, not so much the end that was the problem.
For me, I definitely agree kind of with what you said. I'm also a Theo major, and so I realize the chances of making a lot of money is slim. But what I've sort of done, and I have to remind myself every day that it's not necessarily a virtuous way of thinking, is that I've disguised like that mainstream meaning of success in this type of lifestyle, like this career path I'm going down. Like, for example, okay, I'm not going to make a bunch of money, but I want to help people. And so in my head it's like, oh, well, I'm going to be the best helper I can be. Like, am I helping better than that person? Like, at the end of the day, I realize I still think that. I know it's not right, but it's still a thought that pops up every day. So it's just interesting.
That's great. And if somebody else is helping better than me, then, man, there must be something wrong with them, right? Or Nietzsche calls that ressentiment, that I resent the other person, or I find some reason why that other person is a rotten rat bastard, simply because they're better at their job than I am, or whatever. I hate people who are better than me at whatever it is that I consider success to be. Yeah.
I think growing up, I probably did similarly feel that success was making sure that either I get the best marks or I got no marks, like if they were marking you off for talking in the hall. I was in a time period where you had to curtsy for the nuns and that sort of thing. I'm looking at you thinking somebody knows what I'm talking about. So you didn't get the marks where you weren't supposed to get them, and you got them where you needed to get them. And but you know, as life has gone on, we've had a lot of cancer and death in our family, and it has just kind of gives you just one more opportunity over and over again to realize that it's really about connection. For me, it's feeling like at the end of my life, will I have connected people? So that's where I've gone with it, and feeling that you have made, I know what the other piece was, is that also it's about being where I am. Because it's always about, I gotta get ready to go, I'm busy life, you know, you're packing up to go somewhere else, and you gotta think about this, and you're late here, and just realizing it's really about being where I am, and not about trying to get somewhere else, or trying to come down from where I was. So that's another, when I can succeed in being where I am, and doing it in a connecting sort of way, that feels good. But my false one is, as I was sharing, is finishing something. You know, it's like, good, that's done, check, success. Oh, yes. Yes.
Success.
Oh, yes. Or just, it's random, but yeah, they're checked off.
Great, thank you.
I hear all the young people lamenting the not going to be making any money, and I was sharing with Dan here that his comment about being the best giver or whatever, and I said from a middle-aged man's perspective, I'm just so thrilled and impressed, I guess, for lack of a better word, that he, at this young age, he's doing such a wonderful thing that I wouldn't worry about that. I mean, it's like I don't even look at that and go, oh, I don't even consider that. I'm just like Abby, I just think it's so wonderful these young people are doing these great things. The money thing, I was sharing with our group that, I've never made a lot of money. We had a typical role reversal in our marriage, and the things that I got the greatest joy out of certainly aren't considered a success for a man in this culture. So I think the ultimate success, which I'm still working on, would be to be content with whatever makes you happy. And I think that would be the ultimate success.
I think that something that I'm trying to do right now is detach, success for me is detaching the word success from anything that I look at. So like Ron was saying, 2 weeks ago, did you have a successful meditation? That's trying to quantify and say you did this correctly, you did this incorrectly to anything. And it kind of relates back to the rain and the rhinoceros, there's no purpose, meaning to the rain, it just is. And so was it a successful rain? Did we have a successful rainy season? It's just detaching that word from things and just considering them as they are and not whether it was successful or not.
Something we also talked about is, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear what you guys have to say with it, is that tension of, I think Merton would very much support you carving out a place for you in the world, not necessarily putting your stamp on it, but at least discovering who you are in relation to the world itself, to other people, and all that stuff. And isn't
Yeah, and that's to the question that Sarah was asking before, right? Is it just, or who is it, Maria, somebody in there was asking about, are you know, he's a success, millions of people are reading his books, like, so how, is he just pushing off entirely or redefining? And, I mean, I think that he would redefine in the sense of, like, when he's saying, be anything you want, be drunks, bastards, and madmen of all shapes and sorts, which I love that line. I've messed it up, but whatever, I love it, what he's saying there, I think, is not saying go fail at life. You'll do that anyway, But the standard definition of success that this guy who's writing the book about success is looking for, that kind of thing is its own kind of sickness, But that doesn't mean that you should go and look to screw up your life, because I think, as he would say, you will do that one way or another. It's just a matter of how do you not be a stranger to your own life? You know what I'm saying? That when he's in the essay, the existentialism essay, he's writing a lot about Kierkegaard there, as I mentioned last time. One of Kierkegaard's big words is leveling, which Merton kind of transmutes into the mass mind, right? How do you adjust to society? Because of course in this time period, the 50s and 60s, psychiatry and psychoanalysis are big kind of modes out there of adjusting to the world, and that's one thing that they've been critiqued for afterwards. But if success gets determined by how well adjusted are you to the world, then in a sick society, to be adjusted is itself neurotic, right? That's Erich Fromm, but it's also plenty of other people who have said the same thing, that like, if your goal is to be well adjusted, if your goal is to be sane, or that it is sane in the sense of fitting into society, what happens when society is crazy, and you perfectly fit into it? You're just a little cog in that insane machine. You're successful as a cog in an insane machine, but true success in that sense is to push off from the insanity, not to blend into it or to just sort of throw yourself into the mass, right? And so again, that existentialism piece for him has something to do with, it's not that success just disappears as a word from his vocabulary, but that the way that it gets defined in success, in relation to adaptation to the norms or the baseline of what everybody else out there considers successful, is a recipe, if you're not careful, for disaster. And we'll start reading stuff about his use of Adolf Eichmann soon enough, who, by lots of accounts, was very successful in keeping the trains running in Nazi Germany. Right? Maria, I know what you're saying.
And I think that's where I start to struggle with Merton a lot in this writing, because he seems to be saying, stop defining your success by other people's recognition of your success. But I worry that it gets pushed so far that he turns away from community. If we as Christians define ourselves by community, you can't stand alone and say, like, I am content with my own self-worth outside of relationship. And I worry about, or I struggle with how Merton connects the two.
Yeah, and I think that's a big tension just in general, because, as a guy who was living in a monastic context, he saw how easily community itself could become another neurotic, conformist thing. He talked a lot about how his abbot would, sort of rail at all the monks when they were in church, that there are monks out there that just want to do their own thing, and that, the true morality is just shutting up and conforming and just kind of swallowing it, And when his abbot had told him, writing about nuclear warfare is not fit for a monk, it's not a fit topic for a monk, he says, this is an unhealthy society, right? So, he wouldn't say no to community. In fact, he says an awful lot of stuff about the value of community, but not at the expense of, Christian community is so good that I just need to throw myself into conformity to that, because there's no sort of ideal community, be it Christian or, capitalist, communist, whatever. I think that he's aware that for all of the good of community, it is still people who are caught up in, that sort of mimetic, if you'll allow that word, that we still base success off of what other people are telling us, and whatever context we're in, that can still be an unhealthy thing. And the danger of it is, are you just a kook? he actually says, he uses the word weirdy in there, like our word weirdo, it becomes a weirdy, like, you know, the people who don't fit in, be it in a monastic context, be it in a capitalist context, communist, whatever it might be, will look like a weirdy, like a weirdo, right? If it's just a matter of not conforming. But, you know, how does one stand against, you know, the entire world if need be? Plant yourself and just say, no, you move. How much community are you willing to push off from for the sake of being a prophetic witness? And he didn't like to think of himself that way, although lots of people have. So I think that's a real tension for him in, one, obedience, you know, because he did take a vow of obedience, but then how does one balance obedience with resisting the insidious character of the mass mind? I don't have an easy answer for you. I mean, I think he would say it would be obedience to God, but he said an awful lot of stuff about how easily communal will, monastic authority will, church will, whatever becomes mixed up with the will of God. You know, the Pope says, the abbot says, my friend says, my theology professor says, when that becomes equated to simply with the will of God, as I've said before, I think usually when God gets invoked, it's to stop people from thinking. You know, and as soon as you say, well, like what the abbot said, you know, the best monk is the one who just conforms to the will of God and doesn't think about it. That's a short step to saying when the Führer says, you know, so troubling there. But I don't know that he has a real easy exit, because what do you do? How do you decide who to live in community with if craziness is all out there in all kind of forms?
And how do you pursue a communal God? Because God is communal in nature.
Right.
If you believe in a Trinitarian God, if it means standing alone.
Yeah. Yeah, Teresa, I'm sorry.
No, and this segue well. I mean, if you, like, God is communal, but if you want a really good example, and I'm stealing from Madeline Lingle here, so this is not an original thought, but somebody who is a total failure with his peer group and his community was Jesus. Like, yes, he had a lot of connections and he had many meaningful relationships, but he was a failure with the political authorities, the religious authorities, with his friends at the end. Most of them were not sticking around to, you know, live up to this great friendship that they supposedly had. Mm-hmm. And yet, Madeline Lingle was writing it at the time, like the 50s, and grew up under this, like, you need to fit in with your peers kind of regimented way of thinking, and yet, you know, we're all supposedly interested in pursuing, in imitating somebody who was a failure by a lot of different standards. And, you know, and I don't know how to answer. It sounds like you're kind of asking, well, how do you decide what is in the, building community and beneficial and successful in a really holistic way, and what is success that's fitting in being a cognitive dysfunctional machine?
Yeah.
I don't know, but clearly there's some pretty good precedent for failing with your peers, and I think I can't get all the words out about this, but yeah,
I think
it's
you're onto something there, yeah. And if you remember back to where I started with all this, that my sense is that infallible is a dirty word for Merton. So, like, if you're looking for a foolproof way to know when you're right, a foolproof way to know when, oh, well, I'm just avoiding conformity because I'm being a prophet, or no, maybe I'm being a weirdo. You know, like, I don't know that he has a recipe for an easy way to just know that you are in the right, you know, because that's part of the human reality, is that we just don't have everything in front of us. There's always another voice to consider. There is a kind of, I keep using this damn phrase, a meta-ethic of hospitality in Merton's worldview of trying to listen to as many people as he possibly can, but you just can't. You can't hold it all together. If you want a funny 25-cent word to use in your next cocktail party, Karl Rahner calls that nociological concupiscence, which, why do you do that, Rahner? You know, there's no good reason to come up with a phrase like that other than to say, you know, like, what he means by that is that, you know, there's too much truth and too much theory out there to be able to just kind of get it together in one nice, neat package. And there's a kind of genuineness of humility in that wherever you are is at best a kind of penultimate answer, a kind of penultimate interpretation. And I think that Merton was well aware that he himself, I mean, especially as a guy who had no access to newspapers, you know, he literally would hide a Newsweek magazine under his mattress like it's a porno mag or something, you know, because his monastic superiors did not allow them any access to the news, right? So he who is trying to comment on the world around him, almost in a vacuum, you know, he knew how tentative and how partial and how sketchy his comments were. And even you look at the titles of his later books, the words that he chooses for his titles suggest that kind of penultimacy. So, conjectures of a guilty bystander. It's a stab. It's a shot. You know, raids on the unspeakable. Right. I'm just swooping in and I'm doing a diving bomb, you know, dive bombing run, and then I'm out and I'm trying it again later on. You know, a vow of conversation. You know, even the titles there are suggestive. I think in that he knows that I'm not giving you the final answer here. The final answer is keep trying. You know, keep listening. So, yeah. How do you know when you're not conforming because you're a prophet, and how do you know when you're not conforming because you're just off your nut?
And that's kind of like the holy tension of humanity, is living that experience and trying to find that balance.
Yeah. Not infallible.
Yeah, I just love the concept of community, or like the conversation. I think it's a very important piece, but I also think that it is an ideal that we aspire to if we think of our own. Not to say that it's not important. I think we find God in community, and I think we find truth in community, and certainly without it we can't have that. But if you look at our communities, like, you know, the way in which we congregate together in similarities, and the outcasts that we keep out because of that, like, that's another, I mean, there's, it in and of itself is an imperfect ideal. I just think to wrestle with that, like, it's an ideal that we are aspiring to, and a very important ideal. I don't know that it's not, it can be ugly too if you look at it in its reality.
I don't want to belabor it, but if anybody else has anything else that you want to throw into the mix here, it's good stuff.
I think one of the personal challenges for Merton, for me, and I'm trying to like combine 8 different ideas here, so bear with me, is like this idea of success and community. And I think that something I have experienced in my own life is like rejecting the machine, and not wanting to be a cog in that machine, and then like removing myself from people who are cogs in that machine, or who still choose to pursue that definition of success. And one of the things I love most about Merton is his Fourth and Walnut story. Fourth and Walnut is now Fourth and Muhammad Ali in Louisville, and it's the center of the entertainment district. And so his corner, there's this little plaque there that says, you know, like Merton's Epiphany moment. And then you look and there's 4th Street Live, which is the giant bar scene. And then you turn and there's the most expensive hotel in Louisville, and on the other corner there's the most expensive steakhouse in Louisville. And I often pilgrimage to that corner, and I get so frustrated, and I think like why this corner, Merton? Why this corner? Because for me it's the personal challenge of seeing God in every person, building that community. And it's so easy to, like you were saying, like make those exclusions within our community. And for me, that comes with this like idea of success, of thinking that like I have a better definition of success than those people who are out drinking in 4th Street Live, or who can afford to go to that steakhouse. But I think the beauty of Merton in my own life is that constant challenge to build those communities, even with people who are part of the machine, and that the way to heal the brokenness of humanity is to build those relationships. You were talking about that was your definition of success, was the connections that you build. And I think it's really easy to build those connections with people who are like-minded, and it's really a challenge to build that sort of success with people who are more unlike you. Yeah, and I think Merton does a really good job about keeping that challenge alive.
It's a good reminder. I remember a number of years ago, one of the Micah students actually, who one of his fellow Micahs said of him, he took a lot of pride in how humble he was. Right? Like, that religiosity became, as much as anything, a kind of cudgel, you know, as a means of poo-pooing people who were not as humble in their religiosity as he was. So, yeah, and as we saw last week, you know, Mark reminded us that Merton didn't always do it perfectly. You know, over at Fort Knox, the rhinoceros is having fun at the end of Ren and the Rhinoceros. An easy way of sort of theming them, you know. But at his best, and I think you're right there, and I mean, that corner is a really interesting place, you know, because it does remind us that when Merton has his epiphany, it is, you know, I see that virginal point that a lot of people are doing an awful good job of hiding it, but it's an ongoing task to see it. You know, Mother Teresa calls it Jesus in his most distressing disguise, and she means, you know, the poor and the ugly and all that stuff, but in its own way, I mean, for people who are not like us, what does it mean to see, you know, somebody who is not a theology major, who is making lots of money, who, you know, we even have a business school representative in our midst here. Not a very distressing disguise there, but, you know, but how easily the person who doesn't look like us becomes the distressing disguise.
Yeah, Merton referenced that a little bit in the Wisdom of the Desert when he talked about seeing the good in Satan. I don't remember which desert father he was talking about, but he talked about this idea of like seeing the good or believing that there could be good even in Satan because Satan was created by God. And just this kind of novel idea again of like, if you say you're going to not be a cog in the machine and that you're going to like have this open idea of seeing God, then it has to be for everyone, even the like people who still subscribe to the lifestyle that you shun.
The devil is not just a supernatural being out there with horns and a tail. To call somebody else, any of that kind of stuff is never innocent, right? And we'll start reading his more political essays about the way that language gets caught up in the legitimation of a lot of bad stuff, starting, I think, next week. So, anybody else?
Yeah, I've heard it said that spirituality is nothing more than being yourself. And then the question asks, you know, can we be courageous enough to do that in a culture that might not accept what we perceive as ourselves? So I think the trick is then finding a community where you can be the most of your natural self as you can be. And I think that would be, an ideal, whether it be a monastery or a family unit or whatever that might be, or a business or whatever work you're doing. And anything that's not authentic, even if you say I'm not going to be a success and I'm going to fight the status quo, we are now a success of being unsuccessful. So you know what I'm saying? It's a challenge.
And since Ron mentioned, you know, being natural, being your most natural self, I'm interested in Merton's use in this essay and elsewhere, but here in particular, of being au naturel. I don't know if you noticed, if you read this essay, that nakedness comes up a few different times. And I just wondered if that struck anybody else, the way that he talks about nakedness, because I think it's really central to his project here of that virginal point, that true self that keeps coming up, or will start to come up more in your seeds. I think he's trying to get after that question of who's the one who's doing the asking. It's not about the reified metaphysical essence out there of, you know, what is this truth, so much as who's the person that's asking what the truth is in the first place. And the capacity of being your true self, the capacity of being your, you know, who you are. Who are you? Did anybody else pick up on that? Because he uses it in interesting ways, I think. So at the bottom of, what is that, 359, I think, is when it starts. Just read a little bit and just see if anything bounces off. The inmost self is naked. Nakedness is not socially acceptable except in crude forms, which can be commercialized without any effort of imagination. Topless waitresses. Curiously, this cult of bodily nakedness is a veil and a distraction. It's an interesting paradox there, that which reveals at the same time conceals, right? A communion in futility where all identities get lost in their nerve endings. Everybody claims to like it, yet nobody was really happy with it. It makes money. Spiritual nakedness, on the other hand, is far too stark to be useful. That useful is an interesting word for Merton too. He's onto something there when he talks about the irrelevant, the useless, the usefulness of suckers, the way he put it last time in Rain and the Rhinoceros. It strips life down to the root, where life and death are equal. And this is what nobody likes to look at, but it's where freedom really begins. The freedom that cannot be guaranteed by the death of somebody else. He says that same thing in The Rain and the Rhinoceros last week too. The point where you become free not to kill, not to exploit, not to destroy, not to compete, because you are no longer afraid of death or the devil or poverty or failure. If you discover this nakedness, you better keep it private. People don't like it, but can you keep it private? Once you are exposed, ... society continues to do the service of keeping you in disguises, not for your comfort, but for its own. It is quite willing to strip you of this or that outer skin, the stripping which is a normal ritual and which everyone enjoys. The final metaphysical stripping goes too far, unless you happen to be in Auschwitz. Maybe a little free association. Don't have to come up with some gigantic overarching thought. Does anything just grab you? Maybe it's just even a phrase from that little section that we just read.
I mean, there was maybe, I don't know how late, maybe more in the 70s, there was a sort of a association with being like, I'm thinking like the sexual revolution, about being able to, like, using your body to express yourself. I mean, there is a sort of way in which I think that there is some validness in, like, being able to be comfortable enough with your body to be able to express itself, like with the Black Arts Movement or with some of the feminist movements. There is a reality that bodies have been shamed, have been belittled to the extent that nakedness, actually in a physical context, can be a liberating point. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's, I don't know if that's like kind of getting back against Merton a little bit, but I think there is a way in which, like, but for him, I think that's kind of commodifying the bodies. I mean, so he would be going, I think that's really in the same vein of where the Black Arts Movement would be pushing against the commodification of bodies, and he says the point of making money,
Right. Topless waitresses
Yeah.
versus that kind of coming to understand the ways in which bodies have been shamed and repressed and so on, I think is more about the concealment than it is about the revealing or the revelation that you're talking about there.
I think when he says that spiritual nakedness brings us to the point where you're no longer afraid, where you don't have to exploit, destroy, compete, you're no longer afraid of death. I think those things are part, the exploiting, the competing, those are part of his view of what the world calls success. And so spiritual nakedness brings us to a point where you don't have to be afraid and you don't have to vie for that sort of success.
Pretty good. Okay.
Yeah, the first line, spiritual nakedness, on the other hand, is far too stark to be useful. That stands out to me because it makes me think of, like, so once you strip yourself of all your titles, I am fill in the blank, a student, I am this, that, whatever, like, what's left? And, like, that's what this nakedness is that he's talking about. He's like, think of everything that you could use to describe yourself and then drop all of that, and then what is there? And that's that starkness, and that's that use of usefulness. Like, none of that's useful because it can't describe you. There's nothing left to describe you.
Yeah, and I think it would be easy to see that in a kind of nihilistic way if you're reading Merton wrongly, to say, oh well, he's just annihilating the person. And I think that what he's trying to do is annihilate the persona, the external thing. The image that always comes to my mind is of, y'all are all too young, I'm too young, but the movie The Invisible Man with Claude Rains in the 1930s, where you take the bandages off and there's nothing there to see because he's invisible, and the only way that you can see where he is by winding something around him, winding the bandages around his head. You know what I'm saying? That those I am the blank, is a way of sort of defining the contours of the self. And I mean, interestingly enough, I don't want to get too churchy or whatever, but you know, when you take all that stuff away and you just say, I am, the kind of, the sort of absolute identification of the self there is, biblically, one of the ways that the God of early Israel identifies God's self, right? Is, do they mean, I am.
God is a being, God is being itself.
Yeah, yeah, and Merton later on in New Seeds, we'll see this in a couple of weeks, I think, will say that, you know, the self must be saved from the individual. That's what salvation is, at least in his context, is, you know, the naked being underneath getting saved from the bandages. That's, we usually think of saving the bandages, but the bandages are what we need to be saved from if we're not really careful. In a biblical sense, too, I mean, nakedness brings up another easy association. Where else do we see nakedness as a theme biblically, early on? Yeah, right, you know, and he brings that in. And I think it's really interesting because of the way that the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and 3 has been used as a trajectory for the whole problem of humanity in the first place, right, the fall, that he brings it in here and reworks it, I think is really helpful. On 362, here in this middle of this big paragraph, the journey was from, he's talking about in medieval monasticism, but medieval theology more generally, right? The journey was from man's fallen condition, quote unquote, in which he was not free not to be untrue to himself, that's Augustine, to that original freedom in which, made in the image and likeness of God, he was no longer able to be untrue to himself, right? So it's a sort of return to one's vulnerable truth, one's unadorned selfhood, like what Ron was saying. Where can I just be me without having to produce a self? Hence, he recovered that nakedness of Adam, which needed no fig leaves of law, of explanation, of justification, and no social garments of skins. That is during Gregory of Nyssa. Merton theologically is most of all a patristics or late antique scholar. If you're ever going to call him a theologian, he would not, but that's really where his forte is in the early first 4 or 5 centuries of theology stuff, the early stuff, because that's where monasticism really digs in its heels. But what he's doing here is saying that the fall is not a fall like, well, you know, you disobeyed God and now you're in big trouble and God's going to send you to hell unless you sort of get right. But that the problem is precisely in the inability to hang on to that nakedness, right? That the fallenness is a sort of, in the words of that existentialism essay, alienation, right? We are the German word is unheimlich. We are literally not at home in our own selves, right? That Heim is home in German, right? We are unheimlich. We are not at home in ourselves. And that's me, right? I am always trying to figure out how can I polish myself up. For you to think better of me, for me to think better of me, whatever, you know? Paradise, just two seconds, Mary. Paradise is simply the person, the self, but the radical self in its uninhibited freedom. The self no longer clothed with an ego. That just knocks me out every time I read it.
I don't remember if Merton touches on this, but where the road that sends me down is that nakedness and that vulnerability were relational in the beginning. And so this awkward, clunky tension that we have between community and the self, and which one do we focus on, and which one is, how do they fit together, I think is part of that we don't know how to be vulnerable and naked anymore in ourselves and with each other.
Yeah, that's right. I used that word mimesis before. Do y'all know Renee Girard? I don't want to waste your time if you know it already, but in fact, SLU over the summer is doing a conference on mimetic theory, and the guy who's kind of at the hub of that is this French theorist by the name of Renee Girard. He's sort of a literary anthropologist. When he uses this phrase mimesis, what he means is the stuff that we want, we don't want it because we want it because somebody else has it, and that we tend to associate being with that something that they don't have. Like if I got what they got, with what they have, I would have more beingness. Like I would be more full in my life capacity if I were to have what somebody else is demonstrating to me that they have and I lack. And what he's saying is that Now, Girard, I think, is one of those guys that only has a hammer. When the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. He uses it for everything. Everything fits into mimetic theory, but I think it's a pretty good tool. Insofar as what he's saying is, when we bounce ourselves off of other people, the only thing we can do is envy them, or all we can do is compete with them, right? Mimesis, literally to mimic the other, right? The only thing that we can do is compete with them. Either I can feel better than you because I've accomplished more, or I am sort of shamed and humiliated and probably resentful in your presence because you have done something that I haven't done, right? Feel free to critique or not critique. I'm interested enough in Girard that it really pisses me off when he gets things wrong. He gets some things really wrong, I think. But I think he's onto something here. Like what Maria is saying, this inability to be communal with the other person without dogging them, without, there's always that edge. But where are you beating me? Where, you know what I'm saying? Maybe not always. Maybe it's too strong to say always. But for me, it's in there a lot. What does it mean to be able to be in real communion with a person that has that kind of edge of spiritual nakedness to it, where you can be your naked, vulnerable, true self without having to constantly produce a self and produce a victory in the battle between my external self and your external self? I don't know.
Patrick, when you said like free associate, the first thing that came to mind was the nakedness, and I thought of dreams. How does that come into dreams, where things are going great and all of a sudden you realize you're standing there in your underwear or less? Maybe I'm oversharing here, but or something and you realize you don't have the credentials, being exposed as a fraud or whatever, and so the thought of the nakedness, how even in in a dream state, how that's they're seeing the real me, and that panic that kicks in.
I imagine, maybe I'm oversharing here, but I imagine most of us have had naked dreams at one point or another, right? And you read any kind of thing about dream analysis, and usually people say that dreams are often about dealing with threats. Things that scare us that we're not processing well during the day. Our inhibitions, our external self gets lowered a little bit, the volume gets turned down enough for us to process that stuff a little bit more. And what does it say when, I would imagine more or less universally, we've all had dreams of being completely exposed before somebody else, and that's a nightmare, right? The nightmare of, but I can't cover myself with anything, you're seeing the real me. Oh, crap, right? Yeah, that's nice, right? That's good. That's awesome. Anybody else?
What's striking me from that last comment is that how sad it is that we all think that if we are truly exposed, what's there is not lovable, or it's not worthy, or it's not enough. I work with a lot of people with trauma, and that is the core thing that they work out of is if I have to pretend, because if you see what's in there, it's not good. It's terrible. But how sad that the comment you made is that you're afraid that if you expose me, you're going to see how bad I am, rather than you're going to see how worthy I am, that I'm good. In the essence of me, I am good.
Big, yeah. And if all of us are there, that maybe the trauma of everyday life might be less damaging than the folks we work with, but if most of us or all of us are having that kind of thing, then there is a kind of trauma of everyday life that leads us to convince ourselves that, when push comes to shove, there's something really radically wrong with me. So I got to hide from you, and from myself, of course. Sorry, there's a lot great answers, and Teresa and
Well, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking part of the problem is that we all see, because comparisons, when you were talking about my meta theory, we all either upward or downward, but we're always comparing ourselves to other people. I am anyway. And part of the problem is we see the bandages and we see the pretty picture of other people, and we know. I know what I look like inside, and I don't like it all the time. Sometimes I do, but a lot of times I don't. And I don't want to share that with other people because they're not sharing that part of themselves with me. I'm seeing their cleaned up, marketable, nice version of themselves. And I think about the relationships where I feel safe, showing the really ugly and kind of scary dark parts of me are the ones where the other person throws that back to me. And there's the kind of like, those are the healthiest communities where there's mutuality of nakedness and vulnerability. I mean, you know, everyone's a topless waitress or everyone's naked in the dream. That's the kind of thing that maybe it's not healthy because you're still comparing and you're like, oh, well, they're messed up too, so it's okay for me to be messed up. But that's at least, I don't know if other people have the same experience, but that's where I feel okay or better about myself, better about the ugly, not so pretty parts of myself, because I can see that, oh, that everyone has that.
Yeah, that's good, that's rich.
One of my favorites is Carl Rogers in his book on Becoming a Human.
Yeah.
And his quote, what is the most personal is the most universal. And once I really figured out that and embraced it, I don't give a shit what anyone thinks about me. I really don't. And I have learned that my vulnerabilities and my weaknesses are my strength. And I play on that, and I don't even pretend to play on my weaknesses. I'm not saying I don't have any, but I function and operate much differently than most people, and probably the people who would work with me on a daily basis, they would probably crap, because I say what everyone else is thinking all the time.
And that can be liberating. It can also be pretty terrifying.
Well, I
for
don't
people
care.
around you. Yeah.
I really don't.
Yeah.
And it's really true. The most personal is every fear and every phobia that I've ever felt, everyone else here has felt. And you have to believe that. And once you believe it and embrace it, then you can really be free to be yourself. That's what I think.
Brene Brown's doing all this great work on vulnerability, and it's that Me Too, like you sharing, young lady, I can't think of your name, I don't know. Teresa, I mean, that's just really beautiful. I would venture that every person here hears you say that and thinks that's really courageous. But if I say it, they're going to think I'm weak. That's Brene Brown's work. It's how many people hear somebody do something really courageous. They think that's vulnerable, even, really be authentic. We think that's really brave. But yet, we do it. I'll speak for me. People who know me pretty well, I'm on this vulnerability kick, and I'll wake up at 3 in the morning and go, oh, no. And then, I'm still glad I did it. And then it's just, our friend here was saying, I think I'm really starting to believe that all our problems come from just simply feeling that we're not enough. And I heard a Buddhist monk talk about that, particularly depression, that it just comes from a feeling of not enough, or not good enough.
I was just going to say, I think talking about all the self you present to other people and the self you have inside reminds me, I haven't read a lot of Carl Jung, but he talks a lot about mask and shadow. Yeah. And the mask being who you're comfortable presenting yourself as. And the shadow is who you are inside, really. And I think great minds have pondered this question for a long time. I think oftentimes it's in the areas of your life that you're most vulnerable that sometimes you have the deepest relationships with people, that you come to the most fulfilling insights about people, experiences you have that you wouldn't have selected to have for your life are often the ones that give you a deeper understanding of who you are and who other people are.
It's nice. I heard somebody mentioning Richard Rohr earlier before we started class. I don't know who was talking about him, but Franciscan priest lives in Albuquerque. And anyway, he's a Jungian, and he riffs off of what you're saying there, and it says Jesus had no patience at all with the sins of the ego, but he was endlessly patient with the sins of the shadow. The stuff that we're ashamed of, the stuff that we don't want other people to see, no problem. It's the sin of needing to clean myself up for you and needing to hold it over you that Jesus did not have much patience with. There's something there, I think, about that kind of shadow work. And people that are doing like he is, with transformative ritual. You might have heard of his stuff. Like he does a lot of men's initiation rituals, but other folks too. talk quite a bit about shadow work, about ability to sort of, grieve the stuff that lives in the shadow that we can't pay any attention to. And grief is the ability just to, as Walter Brueggemann says, bring speech to pain. That one hits me every time. So,
I also really like the relational aspect of the spiritual nakedness, and especially with the imagery of nakedness, because I think a lot of times some of the fear of the dreams being out on the stage, being naked, it's like you can't unsee nakedness. And I think that in spiritual nakedness, it's the same thing. Like once you see a person's true, authentic self, you can't really unsee that. And I think once you experience your true, authentic self and the relational aspect of sharing that with another person, you really can't undo that experience for yourself too. And I think that is something that is beautiful and challenging, and then ends up being difficult if there is a breakdown and the fear comes back and you try to hide that for yourself, or the other person that you've seen spiritually naked tries to take that back as well. But I do think there's this relational aspect to the spiritual nakedness that's really important and really beautiful.
Yeah, I like that. Okay.
I'm in this guy's small group that Robbie Francis actually just started up, and we were talking about vulnerability, and just even in times, sometimes when we feel like we're being most vulnerable and we're telling the deepest things about ourselves, we'll say it in a way that still hides some certain details. And it's just funny that you're being vulnerable, but at the same time you're still guarding against a little bit of something. I mean, I'm not saying that it's impossible to be completely vulnerable, but it's even more rare when you just think of instances like that. I have a billion where I was sharing very deep things about myself, but I'd leave out a word here, a detail here that might bring judgment upon myself, or at least I would feel like it would. So it's just interesting.
See, that was vulnerable. Just but saying that was he.
Yeah, right.
It's
a paradox.
Yeah, by doing that.
But maybe he said it in a way that he left something out.
That's good. Wow.
So recursive. On that note, I thought maybe since Sarah was talking about that inability to unsee and sort of recognizing that in other people, I thought we might do a little quick shift with the time we got left, which isn't a lot, to looking at Hagia Sophia for a minute. One of Merton's, I think, most beautiful prose poems, and I think I mentioned a couple times ago, my friend Chris Pramick, who teaches theology at Xavier in Cincinnati, actually wrote his dissertation on that poem. And he says that he thinks it's the heart of Merton's Christology. He thinks that when Merton is really trying to articulate what Christ has come to mean for him, Sophia becomes really the linchpin of understanding that. And I think that what that's about is a re-articulation of his God image, like I said in the first session. So maybe we'll just look at that real quick with Hagia Sophia. And I want to just show you something. I had mentioned this from the Fourth and Walnut. Why can I not get this one window open? From the Fourth and Walnut business, the version that we see in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, where he's talking about, seeing that point vierge, that virginal point at the heart of all people. There's another version of that story that he talks about with Boris Pasternak. I don't know if you know Boris. He was a Russian author, wrote Dr. Zhivago as kind of his best-known work, won the Nobel Peace Prize, or won the Nobel Prize, whatever. So we're used to this, right? We've all been talking about Fourth and Walnut. In Louisville, at the corner of Fourth and Walnut, which is now Fourth and Muhammad Ali, as Sarah said, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness. That's one version, but he's got another one in this letter to Boris Pasternak. Suddenly I saw that everybody was Proverb. He had been having dreams about this young Jewish girl that was named Proverb in his dreams, right? To go back to what Ron is saying about with dreams there. And that all of these people shone, S-H-O-N-E, shone her extraordinary beauty and purity and shyness, even though they did not know who they were, and perhaps were ashamed of their names because they were mocked on account of it. That's this from this dream where he has a proverb where he says, oh, it's a beautiful name, and she says, well, I don't like it because the other kids pick on me for being named Proverb, right? And they did not know their real identity as the child so dear to God, who from before the beginning was playing in his sight all days, playing in the world. And if you, I don't know if you pick up on that reference there at the end, from before the beginning, playing in his sight, that's a reference from the wisdom literature, right? From the book of wisdom in the Old Testament. And it's a reference to the figure of Sophia, right? Whom I mentioned 2 times ago. Which, modern biblical interpreters look at Sophia and they say, oh, isn't this interesting? It's like a sort of feminine personification of God and all that stuff. And feminist theologians in the last 30 or 40 years have kind of latched on and say, look, there is a way to rethink this sort of Santa/Zeus God image that I talked about in the class, that even in the biblical tradition, there is this image of God being presented not just, yes, in feminine categories, but beyond that, through the image of play, right? Through the image of the delight in the world, playing in the world. What a different image from the kind of, as an example, the Jonathan Edwards sinners in the hands of an angry God, and God's just holding you over the flames like a spider, just ready to drop you at any second, right? Playing in the world is not like playing with you like I'm just going to fry you, right?
I don't know, if this is jumping too far in the class, but I think it's prevalent here, maybe even with the Hagia Sophia, but and even kind of maybe you criticize it, but even when we're talking about sharing ourselves, talking about this awesome discussion we've been having in the past hour or so, but all of it's very it's very real, obviously very raw, but it's also very kind of heavy, very, I don't know, I almost just think masculine, almost very sort of, in a way that it's almost sort of despairing. And then when I read texts like this, and even later on the Journal Dance by Merton, talk about it like this dancing God, it sort of reminds me of just this, because even the Journal Dance, when we read that, he talks about just throwing everything away. It's almost like we have to take into account, while I think we can be this heavy despair, we almost have to be like Sophia and just go, okay, just dance and go away and start laughing, because it's we get too caught up in our own despair, but there has to be something more. And this sort of reminds me of that, of just sort of going, okay. That's as simple as that. It's almost the simple part is just going, all right, I'm okay with it, and just going off and dancing, with the rest of creation.
I find that is a tension in Merton's writing, and I'll say this, Merton has been sort of poo-pooed by a lot of professional academics as being only spirituality, by which they mean a kind of light and fluffy, Jesus loves you, this kind of stuff. Merton, he was doing some pretty heavy stuff and engaging in a world that was incredibly dark, right? He writes, if you remember back to the thing from Contemplation in a World of Action, he says, the fact that I was born into the world of Hiroshima and Auschwitz and Vietnam and all that stuff is not, I wasn't consulted about that, but here I am, right? Mm-hmm. What he's doing is trying to say, how does spirituality carry on in the world of Hiroshima and Auschwitz and Vietnam and the race relations that's going on in the United States and all this stuff, the Cold War. Spirituality can't be light and fluffy anymore, but can it maintain a sense of play? And we've talked about this before, and y'all know me and Nietzsche, but Merton, I think, is drawing a lot on Nietzsche here, who, if you've read any of his, Thus Spake Zarathustra, in particular talks about a dancing God, right? But there's more of this sense of kind of recognition that we're in the shit, folks. We are surrounded by darkness, and you can either just sort of flush it all away and say, oh well, it's just all a wash, or how do we sort of recognize our limitedness and our fallibility and just sort of dive in. Dive in a way that's very different from the kind of diving in of Kierkegaard, who dives in with a kind of leap of faith, like, well, it must all be true, I can't prove it, but I'm just going to throw myself into it, as opposed to the Nietzschean image of there's a kind of joy and excess in the simplicity of this is where we are, this is what we've got is the mess, and if we despair at Hiroshima and Vietnam and Auschwitz and all this stuff, then the bastards have won. You know what I'm saying? We have to continue to dance. What is that book you got on your shelf, Christina? Hard Times Call for Furious Dancing. It's a book of poetry, right? It's Marx, right? Whose is it?
Alice Walker.
Yeah, Alice Walker has a book of poetry, which, I think above all else, Merton as a poet is attempting to hang on to the humanness which cannot be boiled down to prose. The prosing of the world is death-dealing. And I think he would say that Auschwitz and Hiroshima and Vietnam are built upon the prosing of the world, the reduction of the world to categories, to tight and structural certitudes. And so as a poet, as a dancer, Merton himself was not a dancer, although he did get yelled at one time when the abbot walked in and he's doing yoga and he's standing on his head. The monks don't do that, But that kind of dancing image, I think, is an attempt to unprose the world. And so playing in the world like Sophia here is a recognition that when we're in the shit, as we are, we better dance our butts off here. You know what I'm saying? Not because nothing matters, but because we refuse to allow the prose to kill us. And for a poet, to see the way that language gets used to suck the meaning out of life is really powerful. And we're going to go there next time and talk about the way that he is attempting to unprose poetry or retrieve language from the death machines. But I think this image here in Hagia Sophia and elsewhere, like what Brandon is talking about, is really important as seeing the way that theology can become prosaic. And so to write poetry is not just to kind of mess around with words. It's not just kind of making stuff up. But it's an attempt to find a medium that can match the message. Does that make sense? You've heard that thing, Marshall McLuhan's thing, the medium is the message. What that means is that if you write theology in a prosaic way, you end up with a prosaic God, unless you're really careful. So how do you end up with a God that's dancing and delighting in the world? Is that you write in an idiom that is a dancing idiom. You know what I'm saying? Which is, in his terminology, not poetry in the sense of just making rhyme schemes, but poetic in the sense of inviting excess, inviting more interpretation and more commentary, and not settling the argument or finalizing it or closing it down, right? And I think that's part of why, like I said, infallible is a dirty word for him, because it's an attempt to stop the argument if you're not real careful. Right? So let me just pull it up real quick and see if anything from Hagia Sophia grabs you. Also, I'll just note here for you, he frames it along not the entire rhythm of the Liturgy of the Hours, but several of the sections of Hagia Sophia are built upon the time of the day, the monastic horarium of praying the Liturgy of the Hours. So he starts off with the Hour of Lauds, right? It's the 3:30 a.m. I think it's the early morning prayer that the monks do, And the language here that he's got, just right in the beginning, we obviously don't have time to go through the whole thing. In all visible things, an invisible fecundity, right? That word fecund is like fertile. It's just bursting with the possibility of life. A dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. That hidden wholeness, by the way, is actually from Heraclitus. If any of you have read any of pre-Socratic stuff, Heraclitus the Obscure is this pre-Socratic philosopher. And it's this image here of kind of unity of opposites, like what we saw in Learning to Live, right? The holding together of tensions like that, and not breaking the tension by closing it down into something simple, right? There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fount of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This is at once my own being, that point vierge, that virginal point, which is the point at which my deepest self and God's deepest self is the same stuff. My own nature and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, right? Speaking as my sister wisdom. It's good stuff, and I can't spend enough time working on it. Maybe we come back to it a little next week if you want. But does anybody have anything that just struck you if you got a chance to read Hagia Sophia? The whole thing.
It's sort of like the way in which he described our experiences is almost sort of like the ultimate, if you want to say the ultimate trespass, the ultimate sin for a monk, is that he's talking about the loving embrace of another person, or like a woman, of a nurse. And like I know that he sort of had a real deep love for this nurse. So it's like almost like through the the like you said, the unity of opposites. The one thing, the major thing that like okay, oh, he has a Newsweek and things like that, but like you fall in love with a woman, like that's like the ultimate thing that a monk is not supposed to do. Is it's almost like in the very ultimate thing it's not supposed to happen, it's supposed to be avoided. That's where all this comes out of.
Yeah. And just as a little backstory, we haven't gotten there yet in my little kind of jaunt through Merton's life story, but several years after he wrote this poem, he actually would go on to have this, to fall very deeply in love with this young student nurse. What's ironic is that he wrote this thing before that thing happened. So there's a kind of, not prophetic, but you know what I'm saying, like there's a foreshadowing when he's talking about lying asleep in a hospital, right?
Yeah.
And, who's waking him up? Well, in a few years, it'll be this young, beautiful nurse.
So wait, this is like he's not in the hospital writing this?
He is, but not for the one with the nurse, not with the time with the nurse. He had several different operations.
Okay.
He had back problems.
I don't know, maybe then I misplaced. I thought it was that time.
Yeah, because it reads like that, right?
Yeah,
You think,
it does.
but this is actually a previous visit to the hospital, and then later on it will kind of match up with this poem. I'll show you real quick. He actually saw a piece of art that his friend Victor Hammer, who lived in Lexington, had shown him. I don't know if you can really see this. Victor Hammer had this in a triptych, right, in a three-piece panel, wood panel, and he says to Victor Hammer, what is that? And Victor Hammer says, I don't know. I got this thing, and he says, it's Sophia. Poof. And that was kind of the initial burst that led him to write this thing. In Greek, this just says Hagia Sophia up there. But the image is supposed to be, and if you read the poem, his imagery shifts constantly. Is Sophia Mary? Is Sophia God? Is Sophia Christ? Is Sophia all the above or something else? So this is supposed to be Sophia / Mary / something crowning the young Christ, right? But again, his imagery, it's very elusive, and elusive of the kind of dancing poetry, dancing words of not giving you a final answer of who Sophia is, the kind of recognition of this elusive but honest character that lives, that is in Christ, that is Mary, that is us, this homeless wanderer with dusty feet, right, at the end of the poem, as an image of a kenotic, do you know that word kenotic? Self-emptying deity, right? A vagrant, a destitute wanderer with dusty feet finds his way down a new road. A homeless god lost in the night, without papers, without identification, without even a number. A frail, expendable exile lies down in desolation under the sweet stars of the world and entrusts himself to sleep, right? Kenosis, Kenosis, self-emptying as a kind of category of re-understanding, reimagining God in a way very different from the kind of unmoved, move, or unchanged changer that you might have heard about in a different context, I think is one way that he is starting to imagine not just God anew, but humanity in light of God anew, right? Who was it saying, King, I think, if I take away all these adjectives, what's left? Who was saying that? Who came? Yeah. I am blank. Well, that's exactly right. I am blank. The only thing stronger than strength is weakness. He says that a couple of stanzas earlier. The capacity for this kind of cosmic humility to be the pin that bursts the bubble is dangerous and treacherous and whatever else, but it might just be, again, the way that, getting past that which keeps us from getting in contact not only with God as a guy out there or a lady out there, but getting in touch with the self that we not just conceal from other people, but from ourselves.
Not to derail the conversation on what is otherwise a really beautiful piece of writing, but I had problems with the masculine pronouns.
Who was saying that? All the ladies in the room were saying the same thing, right? Yeah.
Can we talk for a second about the line that says, as mother, his, shining, circlet.
Yeah. And even to take that further, the idea of there can be this feminine part of the divine, but only if it embodies traditional feminine characteristics of nurturing, and does that really support women?
you know.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually just wrote something about this, about, I mean, Merton writing in 1963 is hardly feminist theorist, avant-garde,
I'm
right?
trying to cut him a little.
Oh yeah, I mean, I will cut him that slack, but at the same time say, this doesn't read quite as well as it could today in light of saying, are you just reifying weakness into femininity? Are you reifying strength into masculinity and all that stuff? As well as, obviously, the kind of continued and really awkward and weird use of the capital H masculine for whenever you're talking about God, the ousia of God. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't shake out as consistently as it would. And Merton never did use like inclusive language pronouns. He just died before that became a thing. He should have known better, that stick with your symbol, stick with your impulse. But yeah, I'm aware of the time, and so I don't want to make people stick around if y'all need to get moseying, but I think there is plenty more to say there about Merton's at times really tortured understanding of gender, right? And women in general. The Brandon was saying before, the affair with the nurse that would happen a few years later may have been the best thing that ever happened to him in terms of coming into contact with a real live woman, but it was not a great episode. It was not Merton at his best by a long shot. And this is really, I mean, Merton writes quite a bit about Marian stuff and some other stuff about Sophia, so femininity shows up. I think he just doesn't have enough contact with real women to actually be able to do much else except abstract them into something like this. At one point, Joan Baez, he was good friends with Joan Baez, the folk singer, and she came out to the Hermitage one time, and this is like 1966 or 67, and he says, can you just take your shoes off? I haven't seen a woman's foot in years. And so she takes her shoes off and she dances in the grass outside the Hermitage, which is cool on her part, but also a little weird on his part. But I think that it points to just the perhaps a bit of bloodlessness in his relationship with women that, at least in the early 60s, still had not really grown into what would become at least a little healthier later in his Hermitage years. You know what I'm saying? And y'all can push back on that or add to it as much as you want, but I am aware that we've gotten past
Poor guy, he lost his mother early on. He didn't have any sisters to kind of show him the award. And so and then he went to the monastery. He has,
Yeah, it was
See, this reads to me that there's some mommy issues in there a little bit. And,
his mom